£100 is very standard. I mean, obviously that is a lot of money, but I consider the artifact, considering the artifact, it's not very expensive. But the one that is expensive is Churchill, and so once I get to the point where I've collected everything else, I'll have to have a discussion with Nikki, my wife, about whether or not it constitutes an investment or a consumption good.
What we thought we'd do, though, today is look at other letters which have changed the course of political history and what they can tell us about politics today. It's all inspired by a new project which has been set up by Dr. Kit Cowell from the King's College London. Morning, Kit.
Morning, Matt.
We've also got Professor Richard Toy from the University of Essex with us. Hi, Richard.
Good morning. Exeter, in fact.
What did I say?
Essex.
Oh, no, it says Essex. It does say Exeter in front of me. I'm just an idiot. I can't even read out loud, which is a good start when we're going to be talking about reading letters. So I do apologise. Yeah, University of Exeter. Of course, you've been. I think we spoke to you before, Richard. Kit, explain for us first of all how this project has come about and what where you started when looking at political letters.
Yeah, so I actually started as part of a book that I'm writing about conservatism in the Second World War. And I found amongst Winston Churchill's papers a big chunk of files called condolence letters. And I couldn't really work out what this was going to be about, because to my knowledge, no one who Churchill really knew had died in the period I was looking at, which was just after the general election. And when I got that file out of the archive, lo and behold, it was full of hundreds and hundreds of letters from the general public and from MPs and well-wishers offering their condolence on Churchill's loss at the 1945 general election. So kind of intrigued by this, I kind of analysed those and started to think about what the history of these letters and different types of correspondence to politicians has been in Britain, and what that might tell us about political culture and people's understanding of politics and leaders before and after.
It's really interesting. It's a reminder that even when he lost the election, it doesn't mean 100% of people in Britain were pleased with that result, like, you know, with any election. But I suppose if you're in your worst moments, when you've just lost the general election, you know, that's gratitude for you after winning the war. He must have taken some comfort for that, for having decided to keep them.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we don't know why these letters were kept rather than others. So he received thousands. The Conservative Party had to actually bring in kind of extra workers to go through them all. They had to set up a small incinerator to deal with all of the correspondence afterwards. And we've only got about 600 of the letters that were sent remaining. But whether or not he read all of them, we know that he certainly read some of them, and he replied directly to individual members of the public. And we have records certainly of his staff finding comfort and enjoyment from reading some of them too.
And Richard, this is just one example of lots, haven't it, that you already uncovered of where the public have, in quite large numbers, quite often contacted political leaders for one reason or another.
That's right. I mean, I think there are lots of different motivations that people can have for wanting to write to an MP or a political leader. Sometimes it can be very instrumental if they've got a problem with their housing or some issue like that. That really, after 1918, in the era of mass enfranchisement, the role of MPs changed, so they were much more beginning to be expected to deal with these problems. Some MPs didn't want to do it. They didn't see their role as being a social worker, as some of them put it. But that's become a kind of essential part of an MP's job, detailed constituency work. And then, of course, people may write for quite other motivations. They may be seeking policy change, or, as in the letters to Churchill, they may simply be trying to express themselves emotionally, you know, to have established some kind of relationship or contact with somebody who might seem, you know, quite distant from ordinary people's lives.
And have you uncovered any individual letters which have had such an impact that they have sort of changed the course of political history?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say that. I mean, certainly we have records from one of Lloyd George's Church's advisors in 1918 at the end of the First World War, saying, we're receiving thousands of letters about the need for reparations against Germany for the fact that the Kaiser should be put on trial. And in this kind of diary account, the advisor makes the claim that these letters were one of the things that influenced Lloyd George in his election campaign at the end of the First World War. How far that's true is something we're going to look into. But if it's the case, I mean, that's a really great example of the way in which a politician getting a sense of popular feeling directly through letters initiates a huge policy change with, incredible international and consequences.
It's really interesting that, and even things like the letters that Neville Chamberlain got praising from his response to the Munich crisis. It's a reminder that in the heat of the moment, that history takes a different view. But the heat of the moment, if you're getting lots of letters saying we think you've done the right thing, thank you for trying to avoid a Second World War, then that's presumably influencing you as well. I want to talk about Michael Foot and the who knows best about the Michael Foot letters.
Keith, I think
that's probably me.
Go on then, Kit. Tell us about the Michael Foot letters and vouchers.
So famously, in 1981, at the remembrance service held at the Cenotaph, Michael Foot was pictured not wearing kind of an elegant black dress coat, but a green coat that was referred to in the press as a donkey jacket. And this elicited a lot of howls of protest that he wasn't taking it seriously. Here's this kind of socialist not paying his proper respect. And his archives are full of letters from people sending him pennies, pounds, and even a voucher for an M&S to go and buy himself a new coat. Why he kept these, we don't exactly know, but they've certainly elicited quite a lot of laughs from us.
And so is the voucher still in the archive?
It's still in the archive.
So when unused?
Unused. And in fact, not only do people send letters to politicians, what we're finding is that in the archives, actually quite a lot of gifts still remain. There are kind of cigar cutters sent to Winston Churchill that are knocking around. There are flies for fishing stuck to letters that are in Neville Chamberlain's archives. A real treasure trove out there to be discovered.
When you talk about the archive, what are we talking about here? Because obviously Michael Foot was leader of the opposition, didn't become prime minister. There's not a sort of number 10 prime ministerial archive. How is it that you've managed to get your hands on a Marks and Spencer's voucher that was sent to Michael Foot to buy a new coat?
Well, that archive, that set of papers are at the People's History Museum in Manchester. And I mean, we're very lucky to have papers like that. The collection of them is often down to the secretaries and back office staff that were working for these different politicians at the time. Sometimes these things were recorded for kind of posterity. Maybe they wanted to reply back to people, but often it was a case of just hanging on to what was there. So there's very much a kind of hit and miss approach that we're finding to collecting and retaining these letters that were sent.
I suppose, and in a moment, I want to talk to you about the impact of, if everything's now digital, if people are firing off tweets where they might have once sat down and written a letter. So I want to ask you about that. Are we losing a bit of that sort of understanding of public interaction with politicians? We're also going to speak to Daniel Finkelstein, our very own Daniel Finkelstein, a collector of letters from British prime ministers. So we'll do that next here on Times Radio.
Tom Newton-Dunn. Sunday morning from 10 on Times Radio.
Politico's Jack Blanchard joins me in the co-presenter's seat this week, and while we're all gripped by whether Boris Johnson will survive the Partygate scandal, the Russian bear is preparing to act. We'll speak to Ukraine's leaders to ask what more the West should be doing to prevent the first major land war in Europe in 4 decades. And back here, Plan B and all COVID restrictions end next week. Has the government got it right, or are they moving too early to please rebellious backbenchers? The Royal College of Emergency Medicine will give us their view.
Tom Newton-Dunn. Sunday morning from 10 on Times Radio.
Times Radio with Matt Chorley.
Good morning, nice to have you with us. We're talking political letters, not those letters being sent to Graham Brady, because only he knows how many he's got. And in fact, I'm told that they will never be released. He keeps them and then destroys them, and he thinks they should always remain confidential. So there will never be a time when we find out just how many times Andrew Bridgen sent a letter in calling for a vote of no confidence. I'm joined by Dr. Kit Cowell from King's College London and Professor Richard Toy from the University of Exeter. We're doing this project going through an archives and letters of and even Marks and Spencer's vouchers sent to Michael Foot. But let's bring in Daniel Finkelstein, our very own Times columnist and regular here on the show. And Danny, the reason we've got you on is because you have a pretty substantial collection of letters from British Prime Ministers.
Yeah, British Prime Ministers and other prominent politicians, mainly Prime Ministers. One or two of them I've only got things like warrants that they've signed or little messages. You know, Macmillan, I've got a message sent to one of his private secretaries thanking him for a draft note. But mainly they are substantial letters, at first handwritten and later typed.
And so who don't you have? Or have you got every Prime Minister?
Well, no, I haven't got Churchill. And the reason for that, I mean, really, you can really buy prime ministerial letters very cheaply. Robert Peel's letter to his son about some land deal they'd done, cheaper than Tommy Cooper's autograph. That.
How much do we talk? When you say cheap, do you mean like £5, £100?
No. In that particular case, that was particularly cheap. It was about £60,
okay.
But £100, not very much at all. £100 is very standard. I mean, obviously that is a lot of money, but I consider the artifact. Considering the artifact, it's not very expensive. But the one that is expensive is Churchill. And so once I get to the point where I've collected everything else, I'll have to have a discussion with Nikki, my wife, about whether or not it constitutes an investment or a consumption good. I think my favourite of all the letters, weirdly, a very short letter is just actually a couple of good ones.
Yeah, pick them out, because I've got copies of them as well, so I can see them in front of me. So
yeah, well, so I want to start with this one, which is Dear Ms. Gray, many thanks for your letter. I'm afraid that I received many similar requests, but enclose an autographed cookbook, which I hope may be useful for your auction. With kind regards, yours sincerely, Jeremy Thorpe. And the reason why I find this a very interesting letter is that it was sent on the 27th of July, 1979. In other words, only just over a month after he was acquitted of conspiracy to murder at the Old Bailey, and was completely ruined. And this was from the NSPCC in Rainsford, in Merseyside. And you wonder why the NSPCC wanted to auction a Jeremy Thorpe cookbook 1 month after this trial. So that's one of my favourite ones.
I mean, I suppose at least it wasn't a sort of a guidebook, to Dartmoor. I suppose that's the only way it could have possibly been worse.
Exactly. I suppose my favourite of all is this one from the 25th of January, 1865. So just actually not very long before the gentleman involved in sending this letter died, and the gentleman being Palmerston. It's my dear Phipps. Thank you for your answers about Forsyth. I'm glad you did not write to him, for I found by experience that crazy people have a mania for letter writing, and answering their letters only encourages them. Yours sincerely, Palmerston. That, I think, is a pretty much of a universal.
That's a great letter.
I'm
that's
sure
really
that
good.
Professor Toy, for example, will recognise that as a both historically typical of Palmerston and of letters.
Well, I might say that, of course, it is true that you get many very eccentric letters in these collections. And some people will say, oh, well, you can't put any weight on letters written to politicians because they are all written by crazy people. But I think that we're interested we're not necessarily thinking that these letters will be sort of representative of public opinion in some way, but rather that they tell us that we're interested in kind of marginalized people who may write crazy letters in green ink as well. And why did they then think that it would do some good in their sort of perhaps slightly crazy mental worldview? Why did they think that it was a good idea to write to Margaret Thatcher or Michael Foot or whoever?
And just
Matt, I do think one of the things that is pretty interesting, and I would like to ask both our experts about this. Quite a lot of letters that you would assume would be public property are simply privately available. You can buy on eBay. One of the examples that I've got is Mr. Chamberlain, with his humble duty to the King, has the honour to recommend that Sir Albert Charles Clausen CBE be sworn of Your Majesty's most honourable Privy Council on his appointment as Lord Justice of Appeal, signed by Neville Chamberlain, approved by King George Rex Imperator, in other words, by George VI and King and Emperor, on the 13th of January 1938. I was immensely surprised to find that at a fairly cheap price available to private collectors.
Well, I think that partly when letters have been sort of sent to ordinary members of the public, then of course they belong to that person. There may well be a copy in an official archive somewhere. Difficult to explain how a letter to the King, which maybe ought to have ended up in the Royal Archives, is available on eBay. But of course, it may be that we can't assume that sort of everybody's practices are around the office are really what they should be, and that sometimes you find that things get just binned or destroyed for no good reason. Sometimes they are thrown in the bin and somebody thinks, oh well, this has got an important signature on it, I will pick it up and I'll sneak it out.
Yeah, that must be okay.
Just while you were talking there, Danny, so I've hopped onto eBay, and obviously other auction sites are available. And if you put in Prime Minister letter, I mean, you can get Lord John Russell £20, Disraeli letter to Lord Derby on the Queen's Speech £50, Margaret Thatcher £39.99, Benjamin Disraeli £49.99. How can you be sure that what you're getting is genuine?
Well, some of them you think you have to be quite a good person to imitate Lord. To know who Lord Derby is before you can imitate his signature, but you have to know what you're doing. Most of these, by the way, although they are for sale on eBay, I wouldn't buy them except from reputable dealers. There are a few people who are reputable dealers, and once you establish who they are, you should buy from them. And you might pay a small premium on doing that, but I would not buy it from just a general source, because most of those would be fake. I just love, there are lots of letters turning people down for jobs that end up on eBay. So people end up with their relatives they may not have somebody who was in the cabinet of the Earl of Derby, but they do have a £35 eBay artifact.
And what about, as I was mentioning, Kit, this issue of these days, everything's done electronically. What was once, particularly like the Palmerston, was it the Palmerston one, which is basically, I'd be careful writing letters because that only encourages them. That is a letter. These days, that'd be a WhatsApp between friends. Is the death of letter writing depriving us of insight into what goes on in politics, do you think?
Yeah, quite possibly. Part of this is also down to worries about GDPR rules, worries about the Freedom of Information Act. We know that politicians are quite wary about putting things down on paper these days, much more likely to actually go to old technologies, picking up the phone to kind of do the scheming that might have happened back and forth over correspondence of old. Because that can't be requested by members of the public. So yeah, historians are very worried about what the future might hold and whether we're going to have the same kind of granular detail that we once had to kind of plot and trace the interactions of high politicians over the years. And then actually kind of looking into these kind of questions about who owns letters, who owns copyright behind them, the same with tweets and faxes and emails, some of the things that this project is going to do.
Richard, the some of the examples of things that you're looking at actually go right up to quite recently. Like, for instance, letters that were sent to Jeremy Corbyn that he then read out at PMQs, and there's a brilliant story about letters sent to Gavin Williamson.
I don't know the Gavin Williamson story.
I thought it was he'd asked. I think it was on the on some notes about the project you were doing. Gavin Williamson had asked parents to write to Ofsted to complain about online learning, and instead Ofsted received 5,000 letters of praise.
Yeah,
always a risk that that sort of thing backfires.
Exactly, but I think it also shows sort of the instrumental nature of correspondence, so that people, it may look like a kind of a private act of writing a letter, which will then be sort of read by one person in an office, but in a way these can be collective activities where people are encouraged, whether by a minister or by a campaign group, to write. We probably all get emails which encourage us to email our MP about some particular urgent issue. And then, of course, MPs may be skeptical of what they think are kind of mass-generated letters or emails, and they'll be more inclined to take seriously ones which look like they are written sort of spontaneously, and therefore there is sort of people are encouraged then to try and adapt their own message rather than just sort of cutting and pasting.
I tell you what, Matt, that is true the other way as well. I noticed that there was a certain point around the beginning of the 20th century where the letters being sent by prime ministers cease being ones that they've written themselves by hand and start being either typed. And the one that I noticed that I had bought a letter from Arthur Balfour. It was telling somebody that they were going to get a knighthood conferred by the king. And when I looked more closely, I realised he topped and tailed it, but actually the middle of it had been written by someone else. And that
handwritten by someone else.
Yes, all the ones before that are handwritten by the prime ministers themselves, including Derby, for example, informing the head of Freshfield he wouldn't be appointed a justice minister or an attorney in the government. So he'd been writing even those kind of appointment rejection letters himself. And after Balfour's letter, almost all of them are typewritten, that were just taking up Richard's point, going the other direction. And this is a sort of one on the cusp where the middle of it is handwritten, but not by Balfour. You wonder how on earth they coped with the correspondence. And you can imagine that the only way they did it was, as we discussed earlier, there were these thousands of letters to Churchill. Clearly, there must have been a lot fewer at that time for prime ministers to be able to answer them by hand themselves.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing, the mass communication, even to the point that several people have been in touch and been asked about letters that you've been sent, letters from prime ministers. Obviously, every single person in the country got a letter from the prime minister. We were all told to stay at home. And lots of people have put them to one side and think, well, that's a piece of history. But I think there's one listed here for one of these Boris Johnson letters worth listed for £500 on eBay. Do many? I mean, I suppose the thing about Churchill, Danny's saying that the Churchill ones are the most expensive to get hold of. I mean, I suppose the thing that both Kit and Richard you're finding is that there's so much of this produced. It's very difficult for it to have a value. A huge amount of value for sort of historical insight, but not necessarily financial value, Kit.
Yeah, I mean, in certain cases, you actually have kind of, more than thousands, tens of thousands. In the case of Enoch Powell, who, after his River of Blood speech in 1968, received over 100,000 letters from members of the public. So, yeah, putting a figure on that is very hard to do. But I mean, it's wonderful that people can go out and buy these things, but it's also really helpful that they're in kind of professionally run archives that allow people like me and Richard to have a look at them.
And of course,
I suppose if you actually went to the archives and tried a statistical analysis, you'd find the vast proportion of letters to modern politicians received the reply that the person was grateful for the invitation to come and speak to their audience, but couldn't make it. I've got several of those, and I think those must be the most common of all political letters.
Danny, just on the subject of that, a letter that was sent to you from the office of Prime Minister rather than the Prime Minister himself. It's my favourite one, I think, in the ones that you sent over from the Harold Wilson's office.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. It was when I was a scout, I sent Harold Wilson a letter setting out a whole load of questions I wanted him to answer. They replied saying he didn't have time to answer them. And then a few days later, I got a letter addressed hilariously to Mr. David Finkelstein. But it's from Marcia Williams. Contains a load of answers to questions. I can apply the questions from the answers. My favourite one, because I retrieved this during the time when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the party, and obviously asked him which newspapers he read, and he said, "So Harold reads all the daily newspapers except the Morning Star." On the question of cars, he would probably buy any middle-sized British car. His favourite sport is golf, but he also likes to watch soccer. That ends the debate about, by the way, whether football should be soccer. He receives from between 500 to 1,000 letters a week. That's interesting fact for our letter aficionados. And my favourite one is he does watch television, though he's usually too busy to do so in the evenings, but he likes feature programmes and the Muppets. So he'd obviously be quite enjoying 10 Downing Street at the moment. His favourite piece of music, Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony, the Hallelujah Chorus, and the Emperor Concerto. An absolutely fantastic letter.
Yeah, absolutely.
The great thing here is that Harold Wilson's letters are one of the collections that we're looking at. So you never know, Daniel, we might actually find your original copy in there.
Oh, that would be brilliant.
That would be terrific. Yeah, addressed to Dear David Finkelstein. That's absolutely terrific. It's been lovely to speak to you. It's such a fascinating project. Been carried out by Dr. Kit Cowell from King's College London and Professor Richard Toy from the University of Exeter. Thanks very much for taking us through that. And Danny Finkelstein, thank you for taking us through your collection of letters. We should be playing the Muppets ready, but anyway, that was...